As a graduate student at Brigham Young University, I had the opportunity to serve as a curator consultant for a museum exhibit that would celebrate the 400th anniversary of the original publication of Don Quixote. I'd never done anything like that before, and I was really excited about this new experience. In the first meeting, we talked entirely about objectives and formed a thesis statement that would drive the rest of our preparations. In the subsequent meetings, we talked a lot about framing and about the specific frames that we would use for that exhibit. We were to receive prints from a museum in New York from engravings that were used to illustrate early editions of the Quixote. I wanted to know what frames or what images we were going to receive in order to select the frames that would best go with them. I was surprised to find out from the other curators that they didn't know exactly what images we were going to get, and we wouldn't know until much later in the process. I was even more surprised that they weren't concerned about this. And they told me that for the concept that they were trying to achieve, the frames were actually more important than the images. And so instead of the images determining the frames we would use, the frames would drive the interpretation of whatever images we were to receive. Those decisions in framing were based upon the previous experiences of those professional curators and also their experiences going to other exhibits and seeing the work of other curators. For the few moments that we have together, I want to talk a little bit about framing in our own life, and I want to do that using a few examples from my own personal experience. The first two are going to demonstrate how frames are constructed in our lives through the same mode, both through our personal experience and also through our observed experience of the attitudes and the lives of others. The last example will show how those frames then can be used in order to apply that to the unexpected events that we have in the future. Shortly after we were married, my wife and I decided that we wanted to start our family and have children. Our excitement about the possibility of having children was equal to the disappointment that we felt when month after month after month, the pregnancy test read negative. And so for years, we tried everything that we possibly could to have children, and it still wasn't happening. Eventually, we decided to look into the option of adoption, and as soon as we filled out our paperwork, about 3 weeks later, a very courageous young woman came to us and said that she was pregnant, and she had just found out, and that she wanted us to adopt her baby. And we knew her previously, and this was a really hard experience for us because we knew her and we loved her very much, and we were grieving for her and her circumstance. At the same time, our hearts were just jumping for joy. We're so excited at the possibility of finally being parents. Things got even more interesting when a few months later, we learned that my wife was also pregnant. And I know you're probably thinking in your mind, I've heard that story. It's happened before. It actually does. It happens a lot. In our case, it certainly was a welcome surprise. And so we now have what we call delayed twins. Sarah, who we adopted, and Joseph, who was born a little less than 5 months later. Since then, we've also welcomed 3 additional children into our family. And I thought a lot about what that has meant for us as a family and what frames of reference were developed in the process of waiting specifically. During that time, we developed what I would call a frame of faith for the future. Simply put, that tomorrow would be better, even if that tomorrow happened to be years in the future, and even and perhaps especially if those interim years are full of sacrifice and struggle and sometimes bitter disappointment. That frame became very important to us as similar situations came up in our life after that event, where we had to apply a frame to a situation that we didn't really know the result of. And so as we waited and struggled and waited again for good things to come, that frame became very important to our future. Also, looking back, I realized that if we wouldn't have waited, we wouldn't have thought to adopt. And if we wouldn't have thought to adopt, we never would have had that sweet little girl in our home. And I can't imagine our life or our family without our Sarah. Some of the experiences of our lives are also observed experiences that also create frames for our future. One of those happened as a graduate student at Vanderbilt University. I realized very quickly there wasn't a lot of parking near campus, and so I'd have to park out usually about a half mile or a mile away and then walk in. Generally, if it wasn't raining, that was a pleasant walk, and I met a lot of people, actually, and talked to them on the way to campus. Some of those people lived on those very streets where I walked because they did not have homes. One such individual was Jake. I remember the first time that I met Jake, I talked to him and he asked if I had some spare change. I hardly ever carry any cash in my wallet, so I told him, I'm sorry, buddy, I don't have any money with me, but we started to talk a little bit more. And at the end of the conversation, I said, Jake, I know you probably need a little extra cash, but besides that, is there anything else that I could do for you? And he looked down and he said, no, it should be nice to have a new pair of shoes. And I looked down at his shoes, and I don't know if they had broken or if he actually cut them, but there were holes in the ends of his shoes, and his toes were hanging out the end because his feet were about 4 sizes bigger than the shoes that he was wearing. And I asked him, Jake, what size shoe do you wear? And he said, size 16 double E. So those are some pretty big shoes that Jake wore. And I said, buddy, I can give it a try. And I knew that I probably wouldn't find that in a department store. So that night we went online, my wife and I, and we found some nice boots that we thought would work for Jake. I told him the next day that we found the boots and that they were coming, but it would take a while for them to ship. He thanked me, he gave me a hug, and he said the words that he said over and over again in the many conversations that I had with him throughout the years that I studied at Vanderbilt. He said, that is a blessing. And remember, here's a man who had absolutely no material wealth, nothing. And yet every time that I talked to him, he would find something in his life that he considered a blessing. And not only that, he would state it explicitly and say, you know what? The sunshine today is a blessing, or something else was a blessing. One of Jake's dreams was to someday be on the internet. It fascinated him. He thought, if my name could be on the internet someday, I could influence the lives of millions. I don't know what Jake's doing right now, but I want to talk to him specifically and say, Jake, today your journey online begins. And that your frame and perspective for the future, a frame of gratitude, will surely bless the lives of many others, because he certainly is a blessing. Those frames for the future help us to react to the situations that we don't know are coming, similar to the museum experience. We can't predict the future, but the frames of reference can help us to interpret and react to that future in positive ways. Nobody puts on their to-do list for the week, have a car accident, or contract a fatal disease, or lose a loved one by Thursday at 2 p.m. But all of us at some point or another, probably, if we haven't already, will experience one or more of those type of tragic events in our own lives or in the lives of those who are close to us. Such was the case with Sam and Ashley Harrison, my brother and sister-in-law. Sam and Ashley were married in 2005, and 3 years later, they welcomed a beautiful baby boy into their family. Less than a month after he was born, Sam went with some friends to go snowboarding, something he had done before, and there's nothing about that day that seemed to indicate that anything significant was going to happen. But nothing could prepare Ashley for the phone call that she would receive, letting her know that her husband had been in an accident on the slopes and that he was in the hospital and that he would be paralyzed. Well, that was a difficult moment. I remember when I heard the news, it was hard for me, and I can't imagine how they must have felt. Because just a few moments before, their life was full of nothing but brightness. And then suddenly everything changed in an instant, and they had some decisions to make. The weight of that kind of experience might have crushed that young family, except that they had already established predetermined frames of perspective that got them through that and turned tragedy into a story of triumph. Some of those frames might have been called something like this: families are forever, and love is unconditional. And the one that became a motto for their family was that Harrisons never quit. And so Sam went to work doing physical therapy. He eventually got movement back in his arms and in his hands to the degree that he could move around in a wheelchair. He taught himself to eat again. Then later he relearned how to use the computer keyboard and his cell phone. When his health was sufficient, he went back to college, graduated at the top of his class in business, and now has started his own successful business. They have had another child, a baby girl. And all of this was only possible because of the life decisions and the devotion and dedication of Ashley in changing her life completely in order to keep that family together and to support her husband during a difficult time. Those predetermined frames helped them to get through that situation. It is not that they change the circumstances any more than a physical frame changes the image that's placed within it. It is simply that it gives perspective in order to face that circumstance and to come out triumphant. Few warnings about frames and a few ideas to conclude. One is that when we're framing our perspectives, we don't need to be so rigid about it either. Certainly the frames of our lives can help us to interpret the future, even if we don't know exactly what that future is going to be. But at the same time, those experiences should reframe and reshape our perspectives as we gain more insight and more experience. Sometimes I think if we're too rigid, then that ideology becomes a master to us instead of us using the frame as a tool for our own perspectives. Another warning is that life is not a one-frame-fit-all situation. Even if your frame has worked in your life and has been a blessing to you, that doesn't mean that that will necessarily be the case for another person in their own reality. Sometimes the imposition of frames, even with good intentions, can be very damaging to others. Those frames need to be established by individuals through their personal experience and through their observation of the experience of others. To share our experience is wonderful, but that individual must create his or her own frame, and it should not be imposed by societies or organizations or other individuals artificially. And to conclude, with the frames, we should remember that life actually isn't a museum. Museums are one thing and life is another. And like any metaphor that doesn't have one thing exactly equaling another, it will break down eventually. And so it is with this one and the framework that I'm speaking of. However, I hope that some small part of what I am saying might have some applicability to your life. Because in conclusion, I'd like to leave one thought with the world for this presentation, and that is simply that none of us can fully predict or dictate the future events of our lives, but each of us can choose the frames. Thank you.